Okay, well, thank you, Heidi, for coming and sharing this really interesting topic with us. Tracy and I had a chance to hear some really interesting things a couple months ago, so some folks were kind of had that background. But anyway, this is on shopping addiction. This is Dr. Heidi Harston, and she will share with us her information.
Thank you. So I'm Heidi Harston. I'm a clinical psychologist. I practice in Oakland. And I'm going to share with you some information about compulsive shopping, otherwise known as shopping addiction or oniomania or impulsive buying. They're all the same thing. And I first got exposed to this work at Stanford when I was doing my postdoc on something else in the OCD clinic, in the OCD research clinic. And somebody approached us, actually from Forest Pharmaceuticals, saying, do you think compulsive shopping is a thing? And do you think you could test out this medication, to the person I was working for there. And he said, Larry Cran said, I don't know if compulsive shopping is a real thing, but what I'll do is I'll go on the radio in KGO, I'll talk about a research study on compulsive shopping, and I'll see if we have any responses. So he went on the radio, and we had 600 calls. So in addition to my other research that I was doing over there, I was assigned to interview these people who called in and figure out what this thing was. And it turned out to be pretty interesting. It turned out to be a thing, actually. It seemed like there was something going on. At least a lot of people felt like that term applied to them, even though it wasn't really defined yet at that point. But that was 11 or 12 years ago when I was a postdoc. And since then, there's been some more looking into shopping as an addiction and other behaviors as addictions. Some interesting things have come out of it. Let's see if I can make the slides change. There you go. So I don't know if you heard, if any of you listened to Fresh Air on the radio, there was an interview just a couple of days ago from a neuropsychologist from Johns Hopkins named Dave Windham, and he was talking about addictions with Terry Gross. It was a really good interview, and he had this great quote that I thought I'd throw in to my talk. I'm constantly adding to this, so that means it's now much more than an hour's worth of slides. So some of them I'm going to rush through to make sure I don't keep you over time. But this one, he's talking about addictions and including behavioral addictions like gambling. He didn't mention shopping, but he mentioned gambling and sex and other things that have come into the addiction spectrum. And he says, any one of us could be an addict at any time. Addiction is not fundamentally a moral failing. It's not a disease of weak-willed losers. When you look at the biology, the only model of addiction that makes sense is a disease-based model, and the only attitude towards addicts that makes sense is one of compassion. So that's a good quote for somewhere like here. And it's starting to make a lot of sense that behaviors, and almost any behavior that's pleasurable, could potentially turn out to be an addiction. So behaviors in addiction, there's a lot of information on behaviors that become addictive or the behavioral aspects that contribute to addiction. And one interesting thing that also came out of this talk that I heard Dr. Linden do is that he said the behavioral part of even drug addiction can be a stronger component of the addiction than the actual substance effect on your brain. And he cited this study that nicotine, he says, is about 80% addictive, whereas heroin is only about 20% addictive. And even though heroin, as we know, is a much stronger, much more potent drug on the brain. And that's because, he says, when you take a hit of heroin, it's a massive effect on your brain, and you don't need another hit for another 12 hours. But with nicotine, it's a very weak effect. And so there's tons and tons of behavioral pairings over and over again. You step out for a cigarette, it's a break, it's a little bit of a relief. You step out for a cigarette, it's a break, it's a little bit of a relief. If you're doing a pack a day, you're doing that 12 times a day, or more than a pack and a half a day. You're getting so much behavioral learning that even though a cigarette is only a tiny little effect, if you're trying cigarettes, the likelihood of addiction is a lot higher. Do you have a?
May I ask you a question?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So is that saying 80% of nicotine addiction is behaviorally based as opposed to chemically based? Is that what the 80%?
No, I think that percentage he's referring to. There's an 80% chance if you try smoking that you're going to get hooked on it.
Okay.
Healthy behaviors can be rewarding and addictive too, but not the same kind of addiction as the other things. You don't see people like walking around with withdrawal symptoms, you know, going, oh God, I gotta give money to charity, you know. I wish that was the case. But that's because giving money to charity and doing things out of, you know, generosity or appreciation are the things that they say light up the same exact areas that these addictive behaviors do. They do it in moderation, which is where you're trying to get your patients to derive joy again at that moderate level. Giving is not hyper-stimulating the same way internet porn can be or substances can be. But there are studies that say, for instance, this when people who are given free money, given the option to give it to charity or keep it, if you do brain scans on them later, you'll see that giving it away made them happier, lit up their dopamine area more than keeping the money did. So the point of this is when you're teaching people how to spread their resources for happiness, teach them how to derive happiness from sources other than the one thing they're used to getting happiness from. Giving and generosity and appreciation and gratitude work, and they might work better than some of the things people expect. This is probably review for you all. But how do you know when a behavior has become an addiction? Especially with shopping, because everybody does it, right? You can't really not do it. At some point, you're going to have to go get groceries. You're going to have to go get a clean shirt that fits, you know. So how do you know if this behavior is pleasurable? How do you know when it's actually an addiction? Your first clue is that the pleasure circuit becomes blunted, and that's referring to that neurophysiology, the limbic, medial limbic area in your limbic system, that reward center becomes blunted, which means it takes more stimulation of it to get even a little bit of pleasure out. Now this happens, sometimes people are just sort of genetically prone to having a blunted pleasure system, or reward system, and that means that they're likely to be thrill seekers or pleasure seekers. They're looking for more of a stimulation to get that okay feeling that other people might get from just regular everyday stimulation. Stress blunts the reward system. Stress makes it harder to get a dopamine release out of there. So you're going to have more stimulation. Stress, as you know, presents a high risk for people to relapse into whatever their addictions are. And that's because they're not getting their everyday pleasures the way they're trying to learn how. It's harder when you're stressed out, so you have to, you know, stimulate that reward system more. And also hyperstimulation, habitual hyperstimulation blunts it. So any kind of hyperstimulation, if you're used to eating Jack in the Box or hyperstimulating food, a lot of fried, fatty, high sugar foods, your palate is going to be hyperstimulated and the reward system will be blunted so that other things don't taste like anything anymore. They have to have that level of salt and that level of sugar. Same thing with spending, shopping. If you're used to spending a lot of money, maybe you've gone on one of those shows and gotten a $5,000 new wardrobe from New York, you know, and you've spent a week spending, and you're getting kind of hyperstimulated by buying and seeing what you look like in these new things, and nothing else is going to feel, your old kind of shopping is not going to feel the same anymore, because your neurophysiology might have rearranged itself or rewired itself to accommodate this new level of stimulation. So anyway, if the pleasure circuit gets blunted, you're going to need more of something to get the same high or even just feel okay. So you need more X, whatever it is. More sex, more shopping, more substance, whatever. to feel good, and then it becomes